All right, welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and this is episode 30. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Raj Balkaran. Raj, welcome back to the Yogic Studies podcast. How are we doing today?
A pleasure to return to this podcast. A big fan of Yogic Studies.
Yes, it's been wonderful to collaborate with you. Previously, we had Raj on the podcast and teaching a course at Yogic Studies. I had to look this up. You were on episode 13 back in October 2020. Isn't that kind of crazy to say? That sounds
That is kind of crazy.
That feels like, on the one hand, just not that long ago. And then at the same time, there's so much that has happened between now and then. On that last episode, we did a deep dive into Raj's background, his story, how he got into academia and Indian spirituality. So if you're interested in that, we encourage you go back and listen to episode 13. Since October 2020, a lot has happened for you. I know you've written at least one book. You've launched a new online educational platform. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
That's a good question. So there's different pieces. One piece is scholarship. So scholarship production is continued. I think by that time, my second book was already out, The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Myth. It's my second academic book. A bunch of articles and things, boring things that people can find out on my scholarship page or something. But two of the most exciting developments since then pertaining to what it is we do is I've managed to consolidate my online teaching. I started online teaching in 2017, continuing studies, public education, 2010. 2017, I went online. And in 2021, a year ago, a week short of a year by the time this podcast comes out, I launched the Online School of Indian Wisdom, which sort of gave a home, some visibility and a home for all of the online courses that I teach and the ones that I've designed since. So that's been great fun. A number of fun courses, Sacred Sounds, Course on Mantras, Sacred Anatomy, Sacred Body, it's called, that sort of thing. Courses that draw heavily on Indian mythology, particularly goddess mythologies, which is so key for what I do at Yogic Studies as well. Beyond the school, the other very exciting development is my third book, but it's my first public book for people who aren't university libraries or who aren't grad students.
Mm-hmm. A little bit more affordable, maybe a little bit more readable.
Way more affordable and accessible insofar as in this book, it's called The Stories Behind the Poses. And I narrate, I write 50 stories that pertain to 50 asanas. And I write them in the way that's super accessible and that's actually made to be read aloud. They're written for in mind of this concept that I play with when I teach, where the text is on the tongue, oral culture, oral tradition, and it's gloriously illustrated. I never thought I would write a book that was illustrated, and this one has gorgeous images of the deity of the story in the pose that it's related to. So, for example, if I use the god Shiva for Shavasana, it would be, I can maybe share a screen and show you if you like, but it's Shiva in Shavasana, and they're quite beautiful. Part of why this is so meaningful to our collaboration and connection is that the genesis of this book, if you can believe it, was my first Yogic Studies course.
I kind of had a feeling about that. I sensed that there was interest in that. In some ways, that's where some of the module content went for your course on yoga and Hindu mythology, right? So tell us a little bit more about about how the book kind of was birthed out of that course.
Well, I remember when we were talking about the course, you said that you'd always wanted someone to talk about Hindu mythology, but you were waiting for the right person, but you figured I was the next best thing. So you figured, hey, let's just take a chance on this novice. One of the suggestions you made for supporting, expanding the content that I was going to share in the course was, would you mind tying in to some actual yoga postures? I thought, sure, why not? So the content, especially stories, especially accessibly told stories, it's very shareable. Long before we had social media, this is what was shareable, what people hear and they kind of want to talk about. So one of the students of that yogic studies course, it was yoga and Hindu mythology. One of the students has a tribe of her own. I think her Amparo Rodriguez. She shared it with her students, some of the content from the course that came to mind. She shared some of the stories I told and some of the connections I was sharing in the course. That student worked in publishing, went to her publishing house, pitched it. They thought it was a great idea. And then a few months later, I get an email. This must be beginning of 2021-ish. Hey, would you like to write a book on the stories behind the poses? It didn't have a name at that point, but since then the book has been written and it's illustrated, and it'll be out officially on Yoga Day, on the solstice of 2022.
Perfect. Yeah, you sent me a sample of some of the chapters, and I think the first thing. All right. Well, the first thing that jumps out, of course, is the illustrations. They really are beautiful. Were those original illustrations for this book, or had that artist already done those, or what?
Yes, the woman who was in charge of the book, sort of the manager of the production process, who contacted me, with whom I worked, she really takes great pride in the books that press does. Is Leaping Hair Press. It's a company that specializes in illustrated books, and so she sought someone out to illustrate poses. She probably looked at a variety of artwork from different potential illustrators, and the woman she ended up choosing did such a brilliant job. I'd never met her before, or don't interact with her, but I had to get her email and thank her. And I imagine her name's on the cover of the book as well. I imagine once the book is out, she'll be getting more freelance work than she knows what to do with. Gorgeous illustrations.
Yeah, really talented, beautiful. So, well, wonderful. Well, we're excited for that, and that's kind of special for me to learn a little bit more about the making of the book and those little connections that come out, through these networks, through teaching, through the community. And I imagine too, you've been doing this teaching for a while in a lot of different contexts, but I imagine you kind of saw the interest and desire for such a book directly from teaching and interacting with the yoga community. So it makes sense. I think a lot of the teaching can fit quite well into a book form. It's just a matter of taking the initiative and actually doing it. It's one thing to have the idea, hey, this would make a great book, but I have to commend you, Raj, because you actually wrote the book. You really did it. I can't, I'm sure a lot of us have had many ideas for a book, but I have to give it to you. You really have some gumption and drive to actually put these things into fruition. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah, there's it's so interesting, right? Like yoga studies is brilliant for yoga studies, right? And for that reason, I don't offer yoga courses, because that's done super well. And yet so many of my tribe at the school, without being targeted, there's nothing in the school branding that targets yoga or yoga teachers. So many of them are yoga teachers who want to learn Indian wisdom traditions to deepen their practice or teaching, or potentially to counteract what they view as the cultural appropriation issues. And it was surprising to me, actually, that probably a good third, at least, of the people that come out to the courses, they're avid yoga practitioners, many of them with studios of their own. And so when the publisher approached me with this book idea, I'm like, I'd happily create a resource for well-intentioned, seasoned yoga practitioners who may want to delve into the roots of yoga. And there are a couple in my research for the book. There were a couple of sources out there, but not a whole lot. And to be really honest, even as a scholar of this, I would have been so interested in this book insofar as where you're going to find, 50 vignettes from the epics and Puranas translated and retold, right? So as you well know, so much goes into the back end of that. to present it. Like when you're presenting a story, the choices you make for which version that you translate, how you translated it. So it was a really fulfilling process. Some days you kind of have to just hunker down and do it in the time that you have and just get her done. There was a tight deadline towards the end of last year because I had a couple of COVID ordained setbacks in my life in the middle of last year. I'm fine now. But I had to like get her done towards like Navaratri, actually, the goddess festival was around that time, and it was just right, boom, done.
Sometimes we just need a good deadline, don't we? Well, you mentioned yoga community and this earnest desire to delve deeper into these texts and traditions. So let's do that now. Let's delve deep into the world of the Devīmāhātmya. I'm so excited to talk to you about this because this really is your text, your area of specialization that you've trained and done research and published on. So we're excited to talk to you about it today, but then of course to have you teach this new yogic studies course, a graduate seminar, really 200 level, reading the Devīmāhātmya. I'm excited to talk about that course, but first let's just start, from ground zero. What is this text? What is it about, for somebody who's just totally brand new to this stuff? How do you describe the Devīmāhātmya?
So roughly 15 centuries ago-ish, which in the history of world religions can be considered a very long time. It's the age of Islam. And yet in the history of Indian religions, that's a short time. It's only half the age of the Rig Veda, say, right? But 15 centuries ago-ish, there was this text that was composed, and this text did something radical in the history of Indian religions, and to my knowledge, in the history of world religions. This text says that the big boss upstairs, right, that the divine is a she. It's not saying that it's Brahman, this principle in the Upanishads, or Purusha, or a particular male deity, or Ishvara, God, if you will. This text is saying that the supreme ontological reality that governs and pervades creation is feminine. This is a radical idea in the Hindu world. And it does so, it posits this feminine theology, not in a systematic sutric manner, more befitting the right brain, perhaps. It posits it in a narrative manner where there's a frame narrative of a deposed king who goes into a forest beside himself and receives teachings. And the teachings that he receives are the acts, the feats, the monumental martial acts of the great goddess who combats demons that no one else can, restores the sovereignty of the gods, promises blessings, is hymn throughout. At the end of the text, in the closing frame...
Don't tell us how it ends. Spoiler alert here. Just kidding.
Like any good movie, you know the ending, but it's not a trip, it's a journey. You just enjoy the journey. So towards the end of the text, the king, beside himself, along with his merchant companion, they go off and they worship the goddess. They receive a boon, a vision of her, pleased by their 3-year-long penance. And she says, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And the merchant says, look, my family's cast me out. I have no wealth. I'm sick of this world. I just want liberation. I want moksha. I want realization. And the king says, I want my kingdom back. And the goddess doesn't say, good job, merchant. We're going to give you moksha. You're a real yogi. And king, you've got some work to do, but I'll bless you anyways because you worship me so well. The goddess says that which you desire, merchant, I will give it to you. I'll give you the knowledge. It takes you beyond I-ness and my-ness. And then she says, and you, king, in 3 days' time, I'll bless you to defeat your foe, and you'll have that kingdom for the rest of your life. Oh, and when you're done, I'll make you Manu of the next stage. I'm going to top up your boon. And so part of this feminine vision is this deep world affirmation, where the goddess is protectress of the world. She's part and parcel of the world. And this is a radical idea in the history of Indian religions, such that concepts such as Prakriti and Maya, which can be sometimes subordinate concepts in Hindu philosophy, there are no. Prakriti is the divine mother. Maya is the divine mother. So this is
right. In
exciting
Sankhya,
text.
I think you're kind of alluding to classical dualistic Sankhya, where sometimes Purusha is this male or masculine principle of consciousness, Prakriti being this feminine material matrix. Sometimes Prakriti as the feminine is seen as subordinate, or even in some ways a negative thing that the Purusha needs to overcome. Sometimes this is how it's interpreted. I don't know if that's exactly a correct understanding, right? But that's...
in classical Sankhya, Prakriti is to be understood in order to be transcended and overcome. And my Prakriti is my problem. My obstacle to moksha is my Prakriti. Whereas Devīmāhātmya has this profound insight that your Prakriti is your vehicle to whatever it is you want for. Whatever it is you wish, whether it's something in the world, which is okay because the world is the body of the goddess, or whether it's something beyond the world, which is like, I'm actually shocked that this text hasn't gotten more scholarly attention since Coburn. But I guess it leaves me with a bunch of work to do in this life.
So you've already described this already in so many ways, but who or what is the goddess Devi? And let me add to this, the text and elsewhere, we see all these different names of the goddess or of goddesses: Durga, Kali, Lakshmi. How does this text describe and illustrate the goddess? Is she one goddess by many names? Are these different forms? Are they different deities, different goddesses? What is her nature as this text expresses?
Yeah, so insofar as the text isn't positing something formulaic and limited or comprehensive, insofar as the text is narrative and meant to be generative, one can make different arguments and view differently what we see in a text. And part of my own scholarship as being to, what is in my view, sharpen the vision of what previous scholars have argued, or even turn it on its head and say, look, this dark goddess Kali is not angry mommy in the text. This is a means for the pacification of evil and the restoration of dharma, so that she can be folded back into Durga. So we have this motif in the text where the Divine Mother, one, she manifests various entities. And at the very end, in the third episode, where she meets the last foe, the demon says, "Oh, you're so puffed up, Durga. Like, you think you're so bad." Mind you, she killed all of his armies and embassies and generals, and with the Saptamatrikas, the seven mothers she manifests, and Kali, etc., etc. And the demon says, "Look, you rely on the strength of all of these beings. You're nothing without them." And she's like, "Listen, fool. I alone exist here in this world. These are manifestations of my colossal power. Watch as I draw them back into me. On guard." She throws the gauntlet down and, she pulverizes him essentially. So the text, to me, that's a core feature of the narrative. All of the expansions of the narrative, they all get refolded back in this moment in her last feat where she says, "I alone exist in the world." So one gets the sense that there's one cosmic power, thought of probably best as Shakti, power, energy, divine power. Shakti is one, its forms are many. And part of the play of Maya is the play of name and form. The Devīmāhātmya extends that to the divine level, where the Maya is used on the divine level to bring about the will of the goddess, which is the restoration of Dharma.
So we talked a bit about this in the last episode when I had you on, but as I understand it, the Devīmāhātmya is part of a larger Purana, the Markandeya Purana. So tell us a little bit about even just this genre of Puranas, what they do, and how the Devīmāhātmya kind of fits into the world of Puranas, and contrast that with as you kind of already were, but with other types of Sanskrit scriptures or texts or
Right.
literature.
So part of understanding the Devīmāhātmya, in addition to its archetypal or symbolic or philosophical significance, crucial to understanding any text is its nature as a product of culture, how it's functioning in the moment of its inception, whether that moment was a day or a decade. And so what's happening in the Devīmāhātmya is the borrowing from various strands of previous strands of Indian religion, and the folding in of small g goddesses we see throughout Vedic texts. Vaj, the goddess of speech, folding in of philosophical principles, right? So Cobra, crystallization of the goddess, right? This moment, this drawing from previous moments. Now, in this moment of the authoring, if you will, of the Devīmāhātmya, this is also around the beginnings of, or in the middle of, an epoch of Hinduism where we see the authoring of the Puranas. The Purana is a genre of text that one can think of as Indian mythology. They're compendia of lore, of teachings. Purāṇa, the word itself means ancient. These are tales of old. I'll tell you a tale, of gods and kings and magical things, right? These are bardic tales of once upon a time when the gods walked the earth, or the deeds of great beings. That is the sort of ethos of the Purana. There's also tons of didactic material in the Purana, and they're vast. They're vast in their breadth. There are 18 Mahapuranas. And in addition to that, each Purana has different recensions, different traditions. Creating critical editions is still underway for some of them. Some of them have been done, and then translating them. So it's an ocean of mythic lore. There's no way to drink the ocean. In my view, both as a storyteller and as a scholar, the best manner in which to approach the material is through the lens of whatever story you're looking at. Understanding that upakhana, understanding that tale, and understanding that tale in its context. Why did they put that story in the mouth of this person at this juncture? The most famous example probably of the genre would be the Bhagavad Gita. Why by Krishna? Why to Arjuna? Why before the war? What, etc., etc., etc. So looking at a Puranic tale in its Puranic context will help you to illumine something about how to interpret that tale. So my scholarship isn't just about reading the Devīmāhātmya, it's about how to read the Devīmāhātmya. And that's why I'm super excited at the chance to run this course where I'll get to teach or share what's worked for me. I mean, people may have other approaches on teaching strategies and synchronic strategies for reading Puranas.
Why do you think the Devīmāhātmya and Puranas themselves have been understudied? They're so rich. They're so enticing. I recall, reading Wendy Doniger in grad school, and she would lament, at her early career, how it was sort of the Puranas were kind of thought of as some kind of bastard stepchild of Sanskrit studies or something like that. Like it was like, don't touch that if you want to have a career. Have things changed in the decades since? What is the state of this particular field?
That's such a fascinating question in that Wendy Doniger is, of course, a towering figure, a brilliant, controversial, insightful beyond question. Like, right? Take her or leave her. You can't say she's adult, right? She very insightful woman. And she's dedicated her lives to the study of Purana. Now, she edited in 1993 a volume called Purāṇa Puranis, which is, a key work for sort of taking the temperature of Purana studies at the time. By some stroke of luck or destiny or effort or gods know what or goddess knows what, I had this idea that we need a Purāṇa Puranis 2.0. It's time. Mm-hmm. Some honing signal went off and it's time. So I approached a colleague of mine and said, look, I'll do all the monkey work and all the emailing, but we need to round up the notable scholars of the Western Academy and do this thing. And now, as destiny would have it, 30 years after Puranas, in 2023, they will emerge finally this volume called Visions and Revisions of Sanskrit Narrative. Studies in the epics and Puranas, studies in the Indian epics and Puranas. And so there are 18 contributions to this work, and they showcase a variety of methodologies. And the theme that I think for me personally, both crystallizes this moment and also I'd say characterizes my own work and the work of many of my colleagues is looking to the Puranas as they are and reading them as narrative, reading them synchronically, taking seriously how tradition has decided to redact or present them. And this intervention has taken a generation easily. And this intervention is correcting or course correcting or shifting 150 years of Indological scholarship, which just wants to look at them for diachronic purposes. Which one's first? Which is the your text? What was added later? What can this tell us historically? Historical questions are important without question. I wouldn't begin to be able to understand the Puranas without the historical context as far as we can know it. Mm-hmm. Having said that, many of the contributions to this landmark volume look at the text synchronically at face value. And so this volume is attempting to take the temperature of what's happened a generation since Doniger edited Puranas, and we were fortunate enough to have her write a foreword for this volume. So that'll give some sense of the methods and the theories at play in the field. Responding to your earlier question, in my view, Puranas may be less studied than other texts, not only because of this prejudice, this Indological prejudice that we've inherited. I mean, that is some of it, but also studying narratives is not everyone's cup of tea. As scholars, we make sense of things empirically, analytically, logically, sequentially, and narrative needs us to have a super strong right brain to enter the story world and make sense of the story world. And so in many ways, it may not be instinctive for most scholars to go and study narrative, right? But I think that when you do, in my view, the best mythologists, the best scholars of narratives are the ones that are able to show you something in the narrative and help you to understand something that the narrative is calling you to learn, right? And I think that more and more the Puranas are valued for what they are, as opposed to these bastardized texts that were contrived by priests and corrupted, that these lost texts that could have told us about our ancient Vedic past, but they were corrupted by priestcraft for the sake of sociopolitical interests. I really strongly feel that tide has changed and certainly will have changed before I leave this earth.
Wonderful. Wow. That's so exciting to hear about this project. And that's a big project that you've spearheaded or that you're undertaking with colleagues. And we really look forward to the fruits of that. Sounds like it's way overdue. So thank you for taking that on. And yeah, I mean, I just agree with everything that you said. And I think within my more limited scope and field of yoga studies, I think people have been saying the same thing. Let's look at the Puranas. There's a lot of good stuff there, even as it pertains to yoga and asceticism and some of these topics and didactic and philosophical topics as well. Now, thinking about the text as a whole, as you said, yes, there's history and data and things that can be extracted from it, but at a certain point, the text did come together and it was treated as an extant text. And so tell us a little bit about that. Like, was the Devīmāhātmya read? Was it chanted? Was it sung, performed? Right. Tell us a little bit about the life of the text.
So the Devīmāhātmya is a standalone text And we know that because it circulates separately, and it's one of the few texts where in every crevice of the Indic world, diasporic or South Asian, you may find the odd na that's a cha, maybe, but it's a remarkably stable text, which is astonishing. So it seems to me that it was probably always meant to be a self-circulating text, but nevertheless, it was written in a way so as to be latched in to the Markandeya Purana. Some want to see that process as a book on a shelf. It's a book, it's on a shelf. It's been interpolated. There's a flimsy frame. Let's just take the book off and read it. Yeah, there's utility there, but there's more power in understanding the ancient Dewey Decimal System, the manner in which they file these texts that are symbolic. Why do they put this in the Markandeya Purana? There's no shortage of places. Why is it in the mouth of Markandeya? Why is it in the... I ended up discovering that there's this Glories of the Sun text, the Devīmāhātmya, that parallels it. So clearly, either the Śākta authors model their work after the Saurama, the sun worshipping authors, or vice versa, or something was happening in tandem. Mm-hmm. But there's a reason why they're housing these texts in the Markandeya Purana, voiced by Markandeya. So the Puranic context is crucial. And my entire first book is taking a close look at the latching, the frame, and seeing that frame actually is the Rosetta Stone for telling us how the text wants to be interpreted. And tradition does that so as to safeguard exegesis, or to influence or control exegesis, consciously or unconsciously. This is a brilliant strategy. This enframement and boxment strategy, it's a brilliant hermeneutic device to attempt to influence how people interpret the text. So the text definitely is part of the Markandeya Purana. At the same time, it typically circulates alone. And unlike most Puranic texts, in addition to being a source of reading, reflection, recitation, this text is a recitation in the ritual dimension. So this is the central liturgical text for Indian goddess worship. So very few things are pan-Indic. Right, some festivals certainly are. So Navaratri, at the 9 nights Indian goddess festival that occurs roughly around the autumnal equinox, that is the time in the first 9 nights of the waxing moon, near the harvest moon, leading up to the harvest moon. That is the time when the Hindu goddess, the Indian goddess, is worshipped throughout the Indic world. And this is the text that's drawn on primarily for not just storytelling, but for liturgy, Vedic ritual, right? And so there's this liturgical dimension. The understanding is that one can manifest the Shakti, one can summon the Shakti of the goddess through incanting this narrative ritually, as well as engaging this narrative, orally or visually, right? And so it has a vibrant life. It's called, in that context, I joke that the Devīmāhātmya, the mythological Puranic Devīmāhātmya, it moonlights as the Chandi part, Chandi Patha, as the ritual application or process to the goddess Chandi, another name of Durga, fierce, intense aspect of Durga.
And do we have a sense that this ritual and liturgical use of the text is quite ancient, or is this in some ways some sort of more recent application?
As far as we know, it's ancient. There's conjecture, obviously, because India names, dates, not so much. But as far as we know, it's fairly ancient. I would infer that because after the episodes are finished, chapter 12 is the Palashruti, where the goddess speaks and declares the benefit of reciting the text, and she specifically references the autumnal festival in the text. So it's clear that in the inception of this text as a text. It may well be that the hymns, there are 4 glorious hymns, the hymns may have been self-circulating, we don't know. But at the time of the compilation and composition of the Devīmāhātmya, clearly they were well aware of the Great Goddess Festival. And I would offer conjecture that there must have been very well developed Śākta traditions for them to begin to Trojan horse this bizarre Brahmanical text in the Markandeya Purana, because there's nothing like it anywhere in the Puranas.
So this might be a difficult question, but I want to ask you a little bit more about how this text relates to Shaktism and goddess traditions kind of more broadly. Sometimes we'll hear in Hinduism, there's sort of 3 main forms where God or ultimate reality, the creative supreme principle, as we've said, is, takes the form of Shiva, representing Shaivism, Vishnu or his forms, Vaishnavism, and then Devi, the goddess, and her forms, Shaktism. You also mentioned how this is quite a revolutionary text, perhaps for the first time, at least laid out in a Sanskrit text in this way. It is the goddess, it is she who is this representation of the ultimate. I wonder how that was received by the other traditions of Shaivism, Vaishnavism. Was there a distinct Śākta form of Hinduism that oriented perhaps around this text or others like it? What can we say about actual religious communities that maybe took this text as central, and how did that relate to other forms of Hinduism? So there's a lot in there, I realize, but
yeah, well, it's probably much like the podcast questions I ask on New Books in Indian Religions. I always say the questions are meant to be generative, right? More than limiting or comprehensive in their scope. And so a couple things that come to mind. One, the Devīmāhātmya, to our knowledge, is definitely the first time that we see this radically different vision of a feminine divine. We have many small g goddesses in the Indic world, not dissimilar from the goddesses we see in various Indo-European traditions, right? Greco-Roman skies, etc. But we don't see this vision of a capital G, the divine is a she. We don't see this anywhere before the Devīmāhātmya, and not in very many texts since the Devīmāhātmya. What this leads me to conjecture is that the veneration of a feminine divine is ancient, probably millennia old, but not part of the Brahmanic tradition. And at some point, circa the Gupta Empire, it was so popular, they had to craft a Sanskrit text for her, right? So we don't know a lot about the original communities, or even there's debate in terms of Yuko Yokochi wants to place a text, but 7th, 8th century CE, if I'm not mistaken. There's a scholar named Bihani Sarkar who's written a book called Heroic Shaktism, who shares some insights about the historicity of the text. And in particular, if I'm not mistaken, the ways in which myths of Yoga Nidra and Krishnite myths were reworked in various communities, right? So you can maybe look at Bihani's work if that's of interest to you. But we really and truly we can't pinpoint the reception moment of the Devīmāhātmya, much less the reaction.
And can you say a little bit more about Shaktism just as a particular, religious community, and or are there particular, expressions of Hinduism that really do take this text as maybe their central scripture or text?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the text is that this is a text that's used during Navaratri. And what fascinates me is it doesn't matter if one's a Śākta or not. Mm-hmm. In every Hindu temple that'll commission a puja or a Chandi Homam for the text, across sectarian lines, people will go and partake in this ritual recitation of the Devīmāhātmya. So I don't see it as a text where there are particular communities that have a vested interest in preserving the text. Really is a pan-Indic text. Mm-hmm. But it tends to be more used during the autumnal festival, liturgically. Else, there's a great deal of usage of the text among upasakas for sadhana, for spiritual practice, who will intone it daily in their personal practice.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, You mentioned the frames, the importance of frame stories, both within this text, within Puranas more broadly. You have an article that we'll be looking at in this course titled "The Safeguard of Sovereignty," focusing the frame of the Devīmāhātmya. And you open the article by asking the following question, which I will now ask to you, Raj. But why is the Devīmāhātmya framed by an encounter between a forest hermit and an exiled king? You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but tell us a little bit more about this and why this is an important question that you pursued.
This article was shared in the 2015 World Sanskrit Conference in Bangkok, Thailand, and it was a condensation of the thesis I was then finishing for defense later that year. And this is the essential argument that I share in my thesis with lots of other content that I share, insights that I share. But the Devīmāhātmya, the greatness of the goddess, is told in forest exile to an exiled king, because it concerns sovereignty and the themes of kingship. Sovereignty, with the duty of kings, the pendulum swings back towards world affirmation. So Vedic religion can be considered fairly world affirming. We're looking for blessings and boons, ritual. Upanishadic or philosophical systems, the darshanas are fairly, I want to break free, let's opt out. What we have in the Puranas is the importance of the world and preservation of the world, because that protection of beings and the world is the essential duty of the king, and it's the essential duty of the goddess, who herself is called a queen throughout. And in the text, she restores the kingship of Indra. In the text, she restores the kingship of this king who's in the frame Surata. So this tells us she tops up his boon. Although she blesses the merchant with moksha, she tops up his boon because that's really important to her. But there are two characters, excuse me, who hear the tales. One wants an otherworldly goal, realization, enlightenment, and the king wants a this-worldly goal. And she gives them both boons because she is the one source of power that you can harness for worldly pursuits or for otherworldly pursuits. And I call that the dharmic double helix. Worldly and otherworldly are the two strands of Hinduism, perhaps as expressed in household and renouncer in various epochs of tradition, where Indian religions can't dispense with this walking contradiction of this ethical, moral, spiritual pursuit of the realization that requires one to eschew the world, and this embrace of the world, this embrace of caste, of ritual, of all things laukika or worldly. And I understand the frame as telling us that this is a conversation between the king, emblematic of the world, and a forest-dwelling ascetic, emblematic of someone who's eschewed the world. And they're working out their karmas as Brahman and Kshatriya would at the court, but they're doing it in the forest. So I see that motif as a narrative encapsulation of the Dharmic double helix. And I certainly see the Dharmic double helix as expressed in the dual booning of the goddess.
What is that Vaishya's name?
Samadhi Nam Vaishyoham. Samadhi.
Samadhi. That's
his name is Samadhi.
His name is Samadhi.
And I find this slightly brilliant and even subversive, that Samadhi is subordinated to kingship. And one of the ways I argue this is the case is throughout the text, the ascetic Medus, right, addresses the king, ignores the merchant. They're both sitting there, yada yada yada, O king, yada 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 yada, O king. The merchant's as if an afterthought in the text.
Yeah, interesting.
He's speaking to the king.
So I think you've kind of already hit on some of this right there, but if I was to ask you, why might students of yoga today benefit from studying the Devīmāhātmya? What would you say to that?
Well, I think online platforms like yours and mine and others, I think we have to find a way to institute Parampara 2.0, to share teachings in a way that meets people with where they are at in this time, in this ethos, in this epoch. And I think that the vast majority of people who take courses at yogic studies and are interested in yoga in general, they're not renouncers. They're very much in the world. Perhaps they want to be in the world and not of the world, perhaps not. But they value the body, they value society, they value social change. And yet, they also value speculation, intellectualization, philosophical seeking, spirituality, perhaps. They value the inner life as well. And I think the Devīmāhātmya affords one this narrative arc that speaks to both, speaks to waking up and being spiritual and hearing the wisdom teachings of the sage, but then going and conquering your foe and regaining your power in the world.
How does the Devīmāhātmya in your mind compare to the Bhagavad Gita in this regard? Sometimes the Gita is also described as, these are teachings for Arjuna, for the person living in the world. Obviously, the Gita takes a different frame, right? We're on the outset of this great battle and war, and Arjuna is a kshatriya, as a warrior. But do you find echoes and similarities there, or are there important differences?
Yeah. I find, so one of the things I do in the Goddess and the King, the first book, which I did in my thesis, and I use this chart in a number of publications depending on what I'm trying to argue. One of the things I do is I compare the structure of the Bhagavad Gita to the structure of the Devīmāhātmya. Rather, I compare their frames. And they both have this brilliant move where they introduce a social outer problem, utishta, get up and fight. And then they introduce this inner emotional, spiritual problem. I can't, I'm lamenting. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, they solve both. Similarly, with the Devīmāhātmya, they introduce this outer problem, a deposed king bereft of power beside himself, entering into the woods. But then when he's there, he's lamenting. He's like, oh, what's happening to my kingdom, to my treasury, to my prized elephant? And along comes a merchant who's also lamenting, cast out of his home. What's happening to my family? They're beside themselves. And they go for spiritual teachings, and, they find the sage, and the sage says, very a la the Upanishads, he says, we're all deluded. Look at these birds flying overhead. Deluded to feed their babies, seeking their babies will stay and they won't. We're deluded by Mahatmya. But then he does this brilliant move and says Mahatmya is the great goddess. Oh, and she's the mother of power. She's the king of queens. She's the font of all power, etc., etc. So we have this move where both of these texts start off as with a physical, social outer problem, which allows them to go into the inner life and talk about an emotional, spiritual problem. And then they solve that latter problem to solve the real problem. How do you get up and walk through the world, especially in these times of ours?
Let me ask one more follow-up about that. The Gita, of course, is famously this Krishna bhakti text. There's this strong element of devotion that is reinforced again and again, and ultimately is the solution that Krishna puts forth, to Arjuna. Get up and fight, but take refuge in me. I will, relinquish all, consequences of the karma, of your actions. And, again and again, the secrets of the kind of the devotional life and, a whole theology that is developed entailing, the devotee cultivating bhakti in the forms of bhakti to Krishna. Is Devīmāhātmya, is it a bhakti text? What type, if so, what type of devotion do we find that the Devi espouses?
I would say without question, the idiom of the text, it's imbued with the ethos of bhakti, as with all the Puranas, essentially. Excuse me. So the text is imbued with this flavor of bhakti, and veneration, devotional veneration, is a means of garnering power and favor. of the gods, and they bless. The goddess is so pleased by their sacrifice for 3 years, she blesses them. The goddess is so pleased by the hymning of the gods, she says, Varadaham, I may give her boons, what can I bless you with? And so this motif of, this glorious, glorious hymn, the Shakrati Stuti in chapter 4, it starts off saying that the gods, their bodies were bent in rapturous devotion. That's when they started singing. So devotion is a crucial element to the text. And it's clear that the idiom of bhakti is already in vogue. The Puranas are essentially bhakti texts, but in them you see Jnana Yoga, you see Karma Yoga. And in my view, if I could rewrite intro Hinduism courses, I'd say there's Jnana Yoga, there's Karma Yoga, there's Bhakti Yoga, and there's Shakti Yoga, which would be more of a tantric worldview. And I think that while they're not overt, I think the text without question was aware of tantric paradigms, without question, because you see them throughout the text. So you'll see various types of religiosity, but certainly there's a very heavy bhakti overlay in the text.
So just follow up, say a little bit more. What is the Shakti Yoga then in that formulation?
What's happening is individuals are amassing the Shakti, the power, the energy, what in Vedic times may be thought of as tapas, right? They're amassing the energy in order to gain what it is they're looking to gain. In this case, the energy they're amassing is the body of the goddess, right? She is the power behind all the power that all the gods and demons and humans amass. And it seems clear to me, based on the fact that, she comes out of bodies in every single episode. They didn't have to write it that way. She always emerges from the body of another being. So this emphasis on embodiment and on Shakti in the body is very important to Devīmāhātmya, which really invites me to conjecture that the authors of the Devīmāhātmya were well aware of tantric strands of Hindu religiosity.
All right. Well, with that, why don't you give us just a little bit more of a preview onto the course itself in terms of its structure, what students can expect. Obviously, we're going to be doing a close reading of the text. Let me just say for listeners, for watchers, the course is called Devīmāhātmya, Greatness of the Goddess, and it'll run live from April 11th through May 20th. We're going to meet live twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, for 90-minute Zoom sessions where we'll be reading the text with Dr. Raj. If you're watching this later, or if these dates are now in the past, of course, everything is recorded, and so you're still welcome to join us and view the text or the course in a self-study mode. But with that, I'll open it up back to you, Raj. Just tell us a little bit more about what you'll be sharing with students.
Sure. I've designed the course so that I can share the entire text with you. So we're going to go sequentially through the entire text and cover the major episodes, not dissimilar from a literature class where we talk about the symbolism of this or the characterization of this, or why does the goddess do this? Why does this happen? Why is there this plot twist, right? So we'll pay careful attention to the narrative structure of the text and what's happening in the text. In week 1, we'll do the introductory episode 1, which is 1 chapter. In week 2, we'll do episode 3, which is 3 chapters. And because episode 3 is 9 chapters, we'll do the first half in week 3 and the second half in week 4, and then we'll turn to the boons that the goddess promises and why in the closing frame. And through that process, we'll understand elements of Indian religions. We'll understand elements of the feminine divine. For example, the goddess is related to the earth plane. The goddess emerges from aspects of other beings. The goddess manifests as communal power from the collective wrath of the gods. So we'll look at core themes in the text. And I want to share really all that I've learned from reading the text with you both in terms of what the text tells us about Indian religions, but what the text tells us about the nature and vision of the feminine divine. And me being me, I want to share ways in which we may connect the text to what's happening right now in the world.
And can you say a little bit about which version of the text that we'll be using?
Yeah, there are a handful. I just completed an Oxford Bibliographies entry on the Devīmāhātmya recently, and there I have a comprehensive bibliography I'll happily share with you that consists of everything that was ever published on the Devīmāhātmya in English. There are a handful. They're really only there are a handful of comprehensive scholarly translations of the text. We'll be looking at the translation of Thomas Coburn. It's the go-to scholarly translation from a generation ago. I've been approached about translating again, but in many ways, I feel that's reinventing the wheel. I will share some parts that I've translated for different publications, but we'll have the Coburn as our main text, and then I'll share articles that I've written. There are very few scholars working on the Devīmāhātmya, and there's no one else that I know of who's primarily looking at the Devīmāhātmya, especially as a narrative text. And so many of the sources are my own, and I'll share them with you entirely free of charge, of course.
Wonderful. Well, for anybody who's been curious about goddess traditions within Hinduism, within Indian traditions, if you've studied a little bit or wanted to study the Devīmāhātmya, if anything today in this conversation has excited you or sparked some curiosity to learn more, we hope you'll consider joining us. Really excited about this upcoming course. So, Raj, with that, I think we'll leave it there for today. Much more to learn and to explore in the course itself. But once again, just thanks so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your passion for these texts and traditions with us.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to reappear on the podcast. Great pleasure to be teaching at Yogic Studies again. I had a wonderful time. And this topic, you picked this topic. You were like, how about a Devīmāhātmya course? And I thought, yeah, how about a Devīmāhātmya course? Why not? I really am looking forward.
Sorry to cut you off, but those requests come from the students themselves. This is a course that people have asked us for quite a while. So I was happy that you said yes and that we can deliver it.
Fantastic. I think it'll be great. It'll be good fun. And I look forward to connecting with Yogic Studies students and sharing something about the greatness of the goddess.
Wonderful. All right, Raj. Thanks again. Please be well. Thanks everyone for listening, for watching. Please subscribe, leave us a review, comment on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.